All right, everybody, welcome back to a special Friday edition of Macroeconomics. Friday, 18th of September, macro. Sweet. So today we're going to jump right into Chapter 7. Right, Chapter 7 is going to discuss with us the different types of economic growth. What we mean when we talk about, productivity. And then at the end of the day, why do we care about all of this? Well, we want to increase people's living standards. And how do we do that? And how do we measure that? All that jazz. So first of all, what's our motivation here, right? Are there, benefits to economic growth? And it kind of seems silly, right? Of course there are benefits to economic growth, but it's easy for us to forget just how stark those benefits can be, right? So, when we talk about, the end of the 1700s to the beginning of the 19th century, right? 1825 or something, right? During this period, which wasn't terribly long ago, right? The life expectancy was only 40 years, right? So you would expect to live only 40 years. Definitely here for a good time, not a long time. Most of the families, right, most of the time, they had at least 2 or 3 of their children die. So something called the infant mortality rate was very high back then. Just on a more, practical aspect, right? Nothing moved faster than the speed of a horse. Right? This is pre-industrial revolution. There's no trains. There's no any kind of steam engine, nothing like that, right? The best highway that we had, the kind of the thing that everybody was really jealous of. Let me cover up those buttons. So I'll press on. The best highway that we had was from Boston to New York. And this is a 175-mile ticket, 175-mile trip. And remember, we're using stage coaches, and horses. So this highway, it was so awesome. You could do this in only 3 days. So what we have seen, we've seen a pace of technological advance, right? So the actual rate at which technical change happens that rate is increasing with time. is it, Moore's law, right? You know, the computing power doubles every so many years, right? So we've seen this, and we've been able to actually measure this, you know, in specific industries, right? But it's important to keep in mind, right, that, you know, inventions in and of themselves cannot create growth, right? What do we need? The products have to be commercialized and sold. So, you know, it's not enough to just have technical change. We have to have a proper situation set up such that we can actually take advantage of that. And we're gonna have an example of that when we talk about kind of medieval China. So when we're comparing this stuff over time, right, we kind of, you know, we need some sort of metric. And so, you know, when we're measuring the living standards, right, we need some measure. And so, you know, we've talked about this before, right, that, you know, it's the best, worst one. Best of the bunch, they're all flawed, is going to be what are real GDP per capita. And so if we wanted to, you know, kind of quantify, right, which we always do in economics, if we wanted to quantify the growing prosperity in the 20th century, so the growing prosperity, how would we quantify this, right? Well, we would look at the real GDP per person, and we'd find that the real GDP, sorry, not GPP, and per capita or whatever, right? The real GDP per capita in 2010 was 12 times the size of the real GDP per capita for 1870. So in a period of 140 years, the real GDP per capita increased 12-fold. Now, you know, let's take a real step back here. Are we living 12 times better than they were in 1870? I'd say we're living a hell of a lot more than 12 times, right? So, you know, the real GDP per capita, it's the best measure that we have. It's flawed. You know, it doesn't exactly correlate to things like life expectancy, like numbers of years of schooling, like infant mortality rate, like, you know, like a lot of economists these days, instead of like focusing on these measures of the success of the economy writ large, right? That can give you an impression of something that's going on that's actually not really going on, right? In terms of, let's say that they just like find a bunch of gold or diamonds or something, right? Well, the real GDP per capita is going to go up, but the actual like living standards for the people is not going to increase, right? It's only going to help the people that own the minds of the goals, right? Maybe it'll help the government if the government's taking taxes from it, right? But so this is a flawed measure, but it really is the best one that we have. And the book talks about this, but it's just important for us to keep in mind, right? Anytime we do a comparison across long periods of time, there's going to be complications because of lack of data or the quality of the data. So I found a couple of little animations. So let's go ahead and screen share. Screen share. So, okay, so first of all, let's get rid of this guy as much as we can. First of all, let's go back. Let's take a look at, so we're starting, and what do we see? What do we see as the start here, right? We see the USA is at the top in terms of GDP. This is just our full GDP, not our GDP per capita, right? This is just the full GDP. And we've got the UK right behind us, France, China, Japan, Canada, Italy, India, right? So a lot of this is because it was the 1960s. The Marshall Plan, all the loans, all the armaments that we sold during World War II and afterwards, made it so that we were very profitable in terms of a country coming out of World War II. And also we were the only ones that didn't have our infrastructure blown to bits. So it was a lot easier for us to produce more than, say, the United Kingdom, who may have a similar technological ability as us, right? But they had a bunch of bridges and roads and other kind of stuff bombed to hell, right? Because of the Nazis. I like the music. Other side. So we see, this rise of China, right? Starting, but they're still, down there. They kind of start to lose some. They're right about the same standard of living as Canada, though, 1970. But here's the thing, though. This is not really telling us a good understanding of the standard of living. How many people were there in China in 1971 compared to Canada? Like, probably 50 times more, right? So just because they have the same amount of output doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same amount of, standard of living or GDP per capita, right? So what's the other thing that we're seeing over time? Well, we're seeing that the scale is shrinking, right? So just over time, economies are producing more and more and more stuff, right? We're getting more efficient with how we're producing. We're discovering new resources. We're training up, more and more people, right? So we see, Japan starting to really take off in the early, the 1980s, 1990s. Germany, the rise of the German manufacturer kind of apprenticeship program and their prowess there. So we see that these things, this is not a very interesting one. Let's try to find. This is now looking at GDP per capita, right? So we see the United States, and this is 1903. United States is on top, then we got Australia, Argentina, United Kingdom. But it's not like the crazy amount that we saw in the 1960s, right? And then look, Australia overtakes us. Like the United States wasn't quite a big player until after the First War, and then especially after the Second World War. That's when we really kind of rose to prominence, right? So then we're going to have the Depression coming up soon, right? Oh no, that's another thing. The Roaring 20s right now. So we see there's a lot of vacillation, you know, this increases and decreases over time, but it's a nice way for us to really compare, you know, what's going on not only over time, but also what's going on between the different countries. What does it mean when it talks about the G20 countries? So there's essentially this group of 20 countries, which are all the countries listed here, which are the countries that like are kind of, they're in an alliance, and they're just, it's a grouping that's used a lot to kind of talk about, you know, the top 20 economies, kind of, you know, but it has to do with a summit and an alliance. The other kind of demarcation that we'll see a lot is OECD countries, which is the Organization for the Economic Development. It's essentially all the Western European nations and the United States and Japan, like making, you know, against Russia. Like it was, that's why the OECD was made. So that's also used as a kind of group to talk about those profitable ones. Okay, so now we're getting to kind of where we were before. Oh, and look, we got a little graph on the bottom here, right? So we see that the standards of living over time are increasing for all of them. Got Saudi Arabia on top right here in 1980. Why is that? What was going on then? The oil cartel stuff, right? And you know, they were essentially, you know, creating artificial shortages so that they could increase the price. And but then we started doing a bunch of fuel restrictions and try to break up that cartel, and so their GDP per capita fell into the middling levels and kind of stayed there for a while. So the 1990s, another kind of roaring period, right, where you know, the GDP per capita for everybody really increased in a kind of steady way. And then we have a dot-com bust in 2001. So there was like an overvaluation of all of the different companies. It's funny because we really don't see too much of the impact of the stock market on these GDP per capita, right? Whereas if we looked at the GDP, it's much easier for us to see those periods of recession and expansion. It's a pretty crazy, you know, increase, right? In terms of, it doesn't seem like it's a straight at all, right? It seems like it's more of a quadratic or a curved kind of curve up there, right? Which would be absolutely wonderful. That would be the case. All right. Back to turn this guy back on. You know, I synced you to my phone, and you said you weren't going to walk anymore when you were on my phone. You lied to me with this. You lied. All right, so we've seen this increase in GDP per capita, not only the increase in GDP, but largely the increase in GDP per capita. And one of the important things when we're talking about this over time, right, is we have to realize that there's something that's crucially involved here, which is compound interest rates, like compounding growth or compounding interest rates, are a really crucial factor for us to understand what's going on with these countries, right? And so, for instance, right, in 1870, right, China's output per person, GDP per capita, was about 120% of Ghana's. Ghana is, a small nation in Africa, right? By 2010, China had 4 times the GDP per capita than Ghana. So what happened there, right? Well, what happened there was that China's growth was 2%. Whereas Ghana's was 1.1%. Why is this important? Well, when we talk about compound interest, we're talking about something that pays interest not just on the original deposit, but also pays interest on all previously accumulated interest. So we'll do an example. That'll make things a lot clearer. So, essentially it just means that the interest that's paid in year 1 earns interest in year 2. So let's say, I don't know if you guys have seen this, there's a great Futurama episode where he goes back in time, or no, where he forgot about a bank account that he opened and he found the debit card, and he's like one of the world's richest people now, right? Well, why is that? Well, what if we went and we deposited $10 at 4% interest? That was supposed to be a percent interest. What if we did it in something like 1815, right? 200 years ago. And what if we were evaluating in 2015? So what would happen? Well, essentially there would be $10 times 1.04. So after the first year, you would end up with that amount, right? And then that you would end up multiplying by 1.04. And that you would multiply by 1.04. And so the abbreviation for this, the kind of way that we can do this is we just say, well, it's going to be 10 times, open parentheses, 1.04 to the however many years, right? So this one would only be 3 years, right? But for our particular thing, right, for the 200 years, that one's going to be 10 times 1.04 to the 200. And so this is going to give us $25,000. Does that make sense, everybody? So it's the fact that, you know, so you loan somebody money, and when they pay you back that money, you loan that full amount out again to somebody else. And so you're going to get interest on that full amount. You can think about it like that in a very like micro kind of world, right? And you know, the amount of, and this is part of the reason why it really pays to start investing in your retirement early, right? I know it's like the last thing any of you are thinking, and even myself, I don't do it like I should. But you know, like money that's invested like 10 years earlier is going to just be more money at the end of, you know, 65 or 70, whenever you decide to retire, right? So these, and the rates, right? Kind of what you get on that retirement money really matters, right? So, you know, whether or not you're going to put it in a, you know, more safe kind of bond, mutual fund kind of thing, right? Or whether or not you're going to put it in a more aggressive stock portfolio is going to matter, right? So the difference is in the interest rates, they do matter. So, you know, if we have an interest rate here, and this is that same value of $10 after 200 years, right? So same situation as what we did above. So we know what 4 is, right? We know that 4 is 25,507.5. What about 2? So common sense would say, well, maybe 2 something like 12,000. Maybe it's even something like, I don't know, 5,000. No, man, 2's actually only $524. Very, very different situation, right? What if it's 6? What if the interest rate is 6? Well, again, our common, you know, the way we're used to thinking arithmetically, right? We're used to thinking about things increasing like by multiples of 2 or 3 or something like that, right? So we think, okay, the interest rate increases by 2, you know, the amount should maybe increase by twice the amount or by 200%, you know what I mean? So by 2 times the amount or something like that, right? But this is not arithmetic. This is geometric thinking, right? And so increasing the interest rate just 2 points, but having it be 2 points every year for 200 years means that you end up with what? $1,151,259.04, right? So very, very different. And the GDP stuff is the same exact thing, right? So the growth rates in the GDP per capita have the same effect as these compounding interest rates. And so we have a fun rule. You know, it's a you know, just kind of a back of the napkin kind of calculation, right? If you want to figure out the number of years it takes for an initial amount to double, so you know the book might ask you a question and say, you know, the GDP is this much and the growth rate is this much. How many years is it going to take for that to double, right? And so there's a formula specifically for that, right? So there's a years to double formula. And so this is also known as, the rule of 72. So, given some interest rates, the years to double is going to equal 72 divided by whatever that interest rate is that we're told. And so if, we had that 2% like in China, so the years to double, for China, in our example, would be what? 72 divided by 2 is going to be 36 years. So it's important for us to keep in mind that this GDP per capita measure is the best way to think about it. Really two ways. It's the product of output per labor and also it's the share of the population that's working. These are the two things. These are its dependents, right? So it depends on and so if this is what it depends on, well then we know that what? GDP per capita will increase when what? The output per worker increases, right? The Y, the output per N worker increases. And the share of the population employed increases, right? Share of population. Arrows, not commas. Increasing that. And so have we seen this? Well, yeah, we have, right? So we've seen this in terms of, between 1960 and 2016 here in the United States, we've had a GDP per capita that's increased by 200%, or increased 200%, sorry. And so the output per worker is making up some of that. That increased 133%. But also, one of the things that really happened, during World War II, a bunch of women that didn't go to work, right? Started to go to work, and they stayed in the workforce, right? The share of the population employed And it became more and more acceptable to be other careers rather than, I mean, I had high school teachers who, when they graduated high school and were going to college, the only three acceptable jobs for them that their dad would pay for college for them was a teacher, a nurse, or that was it, teacher or nurse. Very, very sexist. They just like, your family, nobody would support you otherwise, right? So the share of the population employed increased from 36% to about 48%. And so again, why did we see this? There was a larger working age population. Advances in, well, let's see. I mean, there were no big wars that were killing people off. I mean, we had some small wars that we didn't fare too well in during that period, but we also had, medical advances and stuff, right? So, the average lifespan for people just was increasing, right? And so higher lifespans means more time for the economy to kind of get some value out of that worker, right? And so part of it was you live longer. That means there's going to be just at any given time a larger working age population. But also, just like I said, we had an increase in the female labor force participation. So, looking at this over time, from 1960 to 2016, if we start at, 20K, this is 100K, and this is all, real GDP per capita in 2009 dollars. So essentially we're accounting for inflation and stuff like that, right? So we can really compare what's going on between these different years. And so we find that the real GDP per worker during this period increases something like this. And the real GDP per person, right, when we take into account all the people that aren't really working, it follows kind of closely, but it does seem like there's a bit of a gap growing in between them. And then, similar, right? This is the one element of the real GDP, this is the thing that we're trying to increase at the end of the day, right? The real GDP per capita. And the way to do that is to increase the productivity, but also increase the labor force participation. So what does that look like since the 1960s? And this is the share of the population with jobs. Employed. Starts out a little bit over 35%. Tops out around 45. Kind of hangs out between the 40 and the 45 for a while. This one starts around the 60, goes up to the 65%, and kind of down back in between 60 and 65, really just because of the recession, right? These downturns. This is all from the 2008 recession. So we understand that we got to get more people working in order to increase the standard of living, right? But how do we actually get them working and make sure that they're productive, right? So what is the determinant of the labor productivity when we're talking about economic growth and long-term trends, right? So determinants of average labor productivity. And so, here in the US, we have labor productivity that, is pretty large, right? It's 24 times that of Indonesia. And it's 53 times that of Bangladesh. So how do we actually account for this, right? Why? Well, economists think that there are 6 factors that determine the average labor productivity. What are those 6 factors? I'm glad you asked. Well, the first one is one that we're all investing in right now, right? Human capital. The know-how, the how-to, right? Making sure that we have the skills, the resources, the ways of thinking, the logic skills, the reasoning, the strategic strategic skills, right? To make use of the what? Physical capital. This tablet that I'm working on is a piece of physical capital. The paper that you're writing on is a piece of physical capital. Your pencil, the chairs, the tables, the projector, everything, right? We're not doing this floating in an ether, right? We gotta be doing it somewhere. So land, and then other natural resources, right? What's one of the natural resources that we need in order to learn that not a lot of people are getting to enjoy right now throughout the country, right? Fresh air that's not clogged with smoke. It's pretty freaking tough to concentrate and learn. You're in the middle of that, right? So it's not just the fact that we need land, but we need these other natural resources, the most basic of which being clean air, clean water, right? How do we put it all together? Right? So what is the technology that we employ to put that land, that physical capital, that human capital all together? How creative is kind of the overall recipe or the overall effort, right? You know what I mean? So there's a certain level of entrepreneurship or management that without which you can be the smartest person in the world, you can be employing the most advanced fabricator, and you can have all of the land and factory space that you want in a certain part of China. But if you don't have the proper management to run that thing, if you don't have a strategy to be competitive as other competitors try to enter the market and undercut you, then it's not going to be a sustainable business. It's not going to really add to the labor productivity. The economy is not going to be successful. Your particular laborers are not going to be successful or as productive. And then lastly, this is one that we've kind of added very recently, but it is very important, right? Is the political and legal environment, right? So what are one of the main reasons that people, U.S. investors and stuff like that, don't invest abroad? What are some of the main reasons? What's happened in the past to companies that have gone and invested a lot of money into foreign countries? Do they always get to keep that stuff? Or does the government of that country sometimes come in and say, oh, this is ours now? So there's always the risk, and they actually refer to any time an investor invests some FDI or whatever, right, some foreign direct investment into a foreign country, they call it an obsolescent bargain. Because essentially, you're doing all this bargaining and stuff, right? But at the end of the day, once you put the money there, once you set up the factory, you're kind of at the mercy of that government. That government can decide to change its mind and say, that mine, that factory, all that stuff, that's actually ours, and can kick you out, right? Why is that? What does the government have the monopoly on? The government has the monopoly on force. Government is the only entity that can do whatever the hell they want to you, right? They have the monopoly on force. Not just our government in the United States, but other governments on their land, right? And also our government on other lands. But that's a different story. So it's not just these things, right? There has to be a proper political and legal environment such that you can actually thrive and the labor can be productive. So let's go ahead and talk through these things, and then we'll call it a weekend. All right. So the first one is going to be human capital. Human capital. So this human capital, this comprises of the talents, the education, the training, and the skills of all the workers. It should be obvious, but the book says it, so I'll say it too, right? Increases in human capital will do what? Increase labor productivity. I mean, unless they get too woke and then they decide to rebel against the corporate culture. But at the end of the day, that's not what we're teaching you to be, right? We're teaching you to be good little corporate drones. Show up on time and jump through the hoops, and you're supposed to jump through the hoops, and all of the signaling, so that later on somebody else can say, oh, this person's going to show up on time and jump through the hoops and send the emails when I want them to send the emails. So Germany and Japan, the losers of World War II, they had to use human capital to rebuild after World War II. So, professional scientists and engineers, they really focused on those kind of programs, apprentice and on-the-job programs. And the Japanese in particular, they were really smart because they increased the emphasis on early education. Now, why do I say they were really smart? Well, one of the things that we found through a lot of observation and different studies and things like that, right, is that the best money you can spend in terms of increasing human capital is at like 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, right? It's like that pre-kindergarten, kindergarten stage. And the older that the student gets, it's like everybody knows this about languages, right? Like, oh, it's much easier to learn a language when you're a baby and you're young. That's like everything, though. So it's like it's really difficult to retool, to retrain, a 60-year-old truck driver, right, who's been driving rigs his whole life into, how to program Python or how to do data science or how to be a social media marketing guru or whatever the case may be, right? Whatever the next wave of technology jobs might be. And so, it always makes more sense to spend more money on training the workforce very, very early rather than trying to, retrain it later, right? And have that more long-term perspective, right? And, we talked about, the cost-benefit principle, right? We did a little essay on here. And so it's the same kind of thing when we're building human capital, right? So this cost-benefit principle applies to the decision of whether to build human capital. And so what's the benefit, right? Well, the benefit is, that there's usually a premium paid to skilled workers. Questions on human capital? Physical capital. So this one, again, should be fairly obvious, right? More and better capital will increase the worker productivity. So I'm going to stare you guys the example. Essentially, more capital is going to go ahead and it's going to increase my output per hour. But as with anything, right, we've got diminishing returns to capital. So essentially at a certain point, you can throw more and more machines, but you're going to need to hire somebody to fix the machines. You're going to need to hire somebody to optimize the flow of the, so for a while there, I was an industrial and systems engineering major at the University in Florida. And they used to joke that, it doesn't matter what you build, like all the other engineers need industrial and systems engineers, right? So essentially, all these factories, like the Tesla factories where they're making the electric cars, stuff like that, right? All of that goes through in the final stage. It goes through somebody who's analyzing the system and is kind of, smoothing out the workflows and the bottlenecks, right? Those things that I talked to you guys about before. All right, so number 3. Land and other natural resources. And so, inputs other than capital are always going to increase worker productivity. And so, we've got, we live in it, right? Land for farming and ranching. So farmers are less than 3% of the population. But they supply the US and export a surplus, right? And in order to do other kinds of things, right, in order to, manufacture anything, we're going to require raw materials and energy, right? So, in order to make masks, they're going to be near cotton plants and stuff, right? In order to make paper, they're going to be near trees. So any kind of manufacturing is going to require the raw materials. And also, what else, do we have like hamsters on wheels powering this stuff, right? No, they're going to need energy as well. Now, some of them produce the energy on site, right? A place like New Belgium Brewery, right? They, all the electricity I think is solar panels and wind um, capture, and so but they still require the energy. It's just that it's renewable energy that they've paid a large fixed cost rather than a variable cost in order to have a constant flow of that. So, resources, right? How do you obtain these resources if you're, a resource poor country, right? So, countries like Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Switzerland they all have high levels of GDP per capita. But very limited resources. What's up with that? International trade. Right, we talked about, comparative advantage and stuff, right? So people are going to trade also just because they don't have those certain resources that they may need. Moving right along, technology, number 4. So technologies, this is the single most important source of productivity improvements. And so, like just as an example, in the 18th century, we had the technology of, like we said before, the horsepower, right? That was all we had. Horses were pulling everything. And then in 19th century, we had the steam. We had the steam engine. My computer's derping hard. Oh, blue screen. Blue screen is fun. So we got a steam engine, right, which helped not only with rail travel, but also with river, right? We had steamboats. Not only rail, so not only did this increase land transportation, but we also had steamboats. All of a sudden we could go up the Mississippi River, right? That shit was crazy. 20th century, obviously, we ended up with a pretty sweet road network. Thank you, Mr. Eisenhower, President Eisenhower. We've got automobiles, right, because of Henry Ford. And we've also got, airline travel and stuff like that, right? And, the expansion, these kind of technological improvements they end up impacting industries beyond the primary application. What do I mean by that? So transportation meant that, farms could expand the markets they have, they can access. We ended up with increases in, medicine, increases in communication. I mean, just think so simply about like the incandescent light bulb and being able to like work through the night and how much that had a impact on everything else, right? And then, electronics and computers. Think of where, your production of work would be, school-wise, right? Without different without your cell phone, without being able to look at stuff on Sakai, with, what I mean? All this kind of stuff, right? So it's not just the original invention, but it's the how that impacts, how that ripples through the rest of the economy. So let's talk quickly about entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship and management. So entrepreneurs, these are the, Henry Ford, Tesla, Zuckerberg, the Twitter guy, right? They're people that create new economic enterprises. And these new economic enterprises are essential to a dynamic, healthy, growing economy. So, I already talked about it a little bit before, but, we ended up with, Henry Ford, with, mass production. Really the first guy to get that right. Bill Gates, and the standardized graphical user interface operating system. I'm just going to write GUI. because I feel like you guys know what that means. GUI OS. Essentially, he was the first one that started that. Before that, so this GUI, right, the graphic user interface, before that it was like, have you guys ever played, no, you probably haven't, but I should make you. They used, the first video games were text video games. So it would be like, you're in a room, and you have to be like, look left, and it'd be like, there's a key, and you'd be like, pick up key, and then it'd be like, you have the key, you know, like, and it'd be like, turn around, and just like, turn around, and go forward, you can't go forward, there's a wall there. Like, all of computing was like that. All of it was, like, if you guys ever been into the command line, you ever like accidentally or like seen, like, probably not, but like all of computing was like that, right? It was all like, yeah, you know, do this, and do this, and do this, and do this, right? You know. I can do one thing maybe. I can config. So it was all like call and response. It wasn't this, you know, point and click and close things and drag things into files, right? That was all Bill Gates. All Bill Gates in his garage. You know, the Larry Page and Sergey Brin. Sergey Brin. These were the guys that created what? www.google.com. They were the first people to really start doing the search algorithm. And so at the end of the day, you know, we hope that, and part of the reason why, you know, part of the story, part of the narrative about, you know, why America, you know, is successful and is prosperous and will continue to be, right, is because of the fact that, you know, we usually champion policies that channel entrepreneurship in productive ways, right? And so, you know, this is going to involve, you know, different taxation policies. And regulatory regimes. All right, we'll pick up with medieval China when we start in class on Monday. I forgot, I thought this was Tuesday, Thursday, so I'm sorry, kept you guys so long. My apologies. I thought I had to 1:15, 3:15. Thank you for staying for the extra long class.